Thank you for tuning in to tonight's episode of Documentaries for History. This evening we are focusing in on the Vietnam War and its effects back home, specifically the anti-war protests that occurred at Columbia University in 1968. We hope you enjoy the show.
According to History.com, the movement against U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War began small among peace activists and leftist intellectuals on college campuses, but gained national prominence in 1965 after the United States began bombing North Vietnam in earnest. Anti-war marches and other protests, such as the ones organized by Students for a Democratic Society, the SDS, attracted a widening base of support over the next 3 years, peaking in early 1968 after the successful Tet Offensive by North Vietnamese troops, which proved that war's end was nowhere in sight. Students for a Democratic Society began organizing teach-ins to express their opposition to the way in which it was being conducted.
One of the most significant protests occurred at Columbia University. The man behind this event was Mark Rudd. Rudd was born June 2, 1947, in Irvington, New Jersey.
According to MarkRudd.com and Columbia College Today, Rudd and his friends sought to end war, racism, and injustice by any means necessary, even violence. In 1968, according to Mark Rudd, 69, Columbia experienced one of the longest and strongest student strikes in U.S. history. While some have applauded the actions that ultimately shut down the university for weeks, others view the activities as having done irreparable harm to the university and forever altering the relationships among faculty, administration, and students. Rudd, as the student leader of the Columbia branch of Students for a Democratic Society, was in part responsible for the direction the protests took and was an intimate of those who went on to stage underground guerrilla warfare against the United States. After Rudd was expelled from Columbia, he became a fugitive from justice to several years.
Let's take a closer look at the Columbia University protest.
According to Columbia1968.com, it was a non-violent occupation of campus buildings that lasted nearly a week. Students and community supporters called for the university to cut its ties to research for the war in Vietnam and to end construction of a gym in Morningside Park. After negotiations failed, the administration sent in the police, injuring many and arresting over 700, triggering a campus-wide strike that shut down the university.
The following is a synopsis from Columbia1968.com that shows how some of the considerable events that took place in 1968 affected our country. Quote, "Years like 1968 don't come around very often. Hope and horror ricocheted around the world in mind-bending fury. The year began with the election of Alexander Dubček in Czechoslovakia, marking the beginning of a thaw that came to be known as Prague Spring. It was followed 3 weeks later by the Tet Offensive in Vietnam, which suddenly made the mighty U.S. seem vulnerable. A week after that, 3 black students were killed by police during a protest against a segregated bowling alley in Orangeburg, South Carolina, in early March. Senator Eugene McCarthy, who called for a negotiated end to the war, came close to beating President Johnson in the New Hampshire primary. Before the month was out, Senator Robert Kennedy had thrown his hat in the ring. The My Lai massacre had occurred, and Johnson had announced he would not seek another term. A few days later, in early April, Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated in Memphis, and 60 cities erupted in grief and rage. The year was less than a quarter gone. At Columbia, as elsewhere, students were reeling. A memorial service for King was disrupted in protest against Columbia's plans to build a gymnasium on public park land that offered only limited backdoor access to residents of the hereby Harlem, unquote.
The following is a detailed description from Columbia1968.com that tells what happened during the days of the protest. On April 23rd, several hundred students gathered at the sundial on the Columbia campus to protest the war and the gym led by the Student Afro-American Society and the Students for a Democratic Society. Some went to Morningside Park, where they tore down a fence around the gymnasium construction site and battled with police. Then they and other protesters marched into Hamilton Hall, Columbia's main undergraduate classroom building, occupied its lobby, and prevented the dean of the college from leaving his office. By morning, African American students continued to occupy Hamilton, while other Columbia and Barnard students, mostly white, took over President Grayson Kirk's office in Low Library. Soon, student protesters took over 3 other buildings: Fairweather, Mathematics, and Avery. For 6 days, while demonstrations for and against the occupation roiled the campus, faculty members attempted to mediate, but to no avail. The stumbling block, a demand for amnesty for the protesters that the administration was unwilling to accept. In the early morning hours of April 30th, Kirk summoned the New York City police, who entered the occupied buildings, beat many of the demonstrators as well as bystanders and faculty members, and arrested more than 700. The building occupation was over, but the outrage was just starting to build. Thousands of students and faculty, many radicalized by the police action, went on strike, effectively shutting down the university for the rest of the semester.
The idea for the gymnasium not supported in any way by Columbia University. Although the gymnasium was something being built right in the area of the university, the students were also upset about the war.
Columbia1968.com also says, the gym was never built in Morningside Park and Columbia's weapons research contract was terminated, but the implications of the 1968 occupation and strike went far beyond those 2 demands. In the wake of Columbia's protests, campuses around the country exploded, and students took the streets in cities around the world, from Paris and Prague to Tokyo and Mexico City. It is clear that the protests at Columbia University touched many people around our country and the world.
Mark Rudd is still alive and well, and his actions back in 1968 changed how the Vietnam War was viewed by people. We hope you enjoyed this short film about the anti-war protests at Columbia University, and we hope that you will join us next week on Channel 3 for our showing of the newest documentary on JFK.